The baby's screams cut through the mountain air like a knife, and James Thornton knew they were all going to die because of it. Through the stagecoach window, he could see shadows moving between the pines, riders, at least 4 of them, drawn to his daughter's cries like wolves to wounded prey. His hands trembled as Catherine shrieked louder, her tiny face purple with rage. Then a woman's voice, quiet but firm, broke through the panic. "Give her to me." What happened next would save 6 lives and break every rule of decent society. 3 days earlier, James Thornton owned 10,000 acres of Wyoming territory. His cattle grazed from horizon to horizon. His mansion had crystal chandeliers shipped from New York and carpets from Persia. None of it mattered anymore. Eleanor was dead. Consumption had taken her in less than a month, leaving him with a 3-month-old daughter who screamed every waking hour. Catherine had colic, the doctor said. Nothing to be done but wait it out. But James couldn't wait. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe in that house full of Eleanor's things and the baby's endless crying. His sister lived in Denver. She'd raised 5 children. She would know what to do. James packed a bag with one hand while bouncing Catherine with the other. She screamed into his shoulder, her little body rigid with pain. He'd tried everything: warm milk from a wet nurse, different bottles, walking, rocking, singing. Nothing worked. The westbound stagecoach left at dawn. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, loaded James's trunk with a grunt. "Traveling alone with a baby, Mr. Thornton?" "To Denver. My sister's expecting us." Pete glanced at Catherine, who was momentarily quiet, exhausted from crying. "Hope she stays peaceful. These mountain passes ain't safe. The Dalton gang hit 3 coaches last month, killed everyone." James's blood ran cold. "I thought the marshal—" "Marshal's dead. They shot him 2 weeks ago." Pete spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Dalton's got ears like bats. They listen for coaches, then strike. Best we all stay quiet as church mice up there." James looked down at Catherine. Her face was scrunched, preparing for another wail. This was a mistake. 5 other passengers boarded. A merchant and his wife, a young cowboy heading to California, a preacher with a worn Bible, and a woman in black mourning clothes who took the seat across from James without meeting anyone's eyes. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled severely back. Her hands clutched a small carpet bag like it contained everything she owned. Probably did. Sarah Mitchell had nothing left. 6 weeks ago, she'd buried her husband Thomas, crushed in a stampede while working the Rocking H Ranch. The same day, she'd buried their son, born too early, too small, never drawing breath. The double funeral had been attended by 3 people. Now she was going to her sister's in California, starting over, trying to forget, but her body wouldn't let her forget. Her breasts ached constantly, bound tight beneath her dress to stop the milk. Milk for a baby who would never drink it. The stagecoach lurched forward. Catherine started screaming. For the first hour, the other passengers were patient. The merchant's wife even offered advice. "Try rubbing her belly clockwise, dear. Works wonders." James tried. Catherine screamed louder. By the second hour, patience wore thin. The merchant kept checking his pocket watch. The cowboy moved to the roof to escape the noise. The preacher prayed silently, lips moving. Only the woman in black stayed still, staring out the window. Sarah heard every cry like a knife to her heart. She knew that sound, the desperate wail of a hungry, hurting infant. She knew what the baby needed. She said nothing. The stagecoach began climbing into the mountains. The air grew thinner. Catherine's screams intensified, echoing off the canyon walls. Pete's voice drifted down from the driver's seat. "Folks, we're entering Dalton territory. Need everyone quiet." The merchant's wife shot James a look that could kill. James bounced Catherine frantically. "Please, sweetheart, please." His voice cracked. He hadn't slept in 3 days, hadn't eaten. Eleanor's funeral felt like yesterday, and a lifetime ago. Catherine screamed, and screamed, and screamed. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because things are about to get intense. The shadows appeared at dusk. Pete saw them first, 4 riders paralleling the coach through the trees. He didn't say anything, just urged the horses faster. Inside, everyone felt the change. The stagecoach was moving too fast for the narrow mountain road. "What's happening?" the merchant demanded. Then they all saw it. Through the windows. Riders in the trees, keeping pace. The Dalton gang. Pete's voice was tight. "Everyone stay calm and stay quiet." Catherine chose that moment to unleash her loudest scream yet. The merchant's face went white. "They'll hear us. They'll hear the baby." James tried to cover Catherine's mouth gently. She screamed around his fingers. "We're dead," the merchant's wife whispered. "We're all dead because of that child." The preacher started praying louder. Sarah watched the riders through the window. 4 men, maybe more behind them. They were closing in, drawn by the sound. The stagecoach hit a rut. Everyone lurched. Catherine's screams reached a fever pitch. Pete suddenly reined the horses to a halt. "Why are we stopping?" James's voice was pure panic. "Riders ahead too," Pete called down. "We're boxed in." Silence fell inside the coach. Except for Catherine. The merchant stood, his face twisted with fear and rage. "Gag the child, now, or I'll do it myself." "You'll do no such thing." James pulled Catherine closer. "Then we'll throw you both out. Let the Daltons have you instead of us." The merchant's wife nodded frantically. Even the preacher looked conflicted. James backed into the corner, shielding Catherine with his body. His daughter, his last piece of Eleanor. "I won't let you touch her." The merchant lunged forward. "Give her to me." Everyone froze. The woman in black had spoken for the first time. She was standing, her voice quiet but commanding. "Give her to me," Sarah repeated, looking directly at James. "What? Why would I?" "Because I can help her. Give her to me now." Something in her eyes made James move. He handed Catherine over. Sarah sat down, cradling the screaming infant. Then, without hesitation, she began unbuttoning her dress. The merchant's wife gasped. "What is she?" "Turn around," Sarah said flatly. "All of you." They understood then. The preacher spun away immediately. The merchant and his wife followed. James stared, confused, until Sarah met his eyes. "Your daughter is starving," she said simply. "I can feed her." "But you're not... You don't have..." "I do." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I buried my son 6 weeks ago. My body doesn't know he's gone." James felt tears spring to his eyes. Sarah brought Catherine to her breast. The baby latched on immediately, and the screaming stopped. The silence was deafening. Outside, they could hear the riders moving closer, calling to each other. But inside the coach, there was only the soft sound of an infant feeding. Pete's voice drifted down, barely a whisper. "They're passing us. Stay quiet." Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, Pete clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward slowly, carefully. The riders in the trees fell behind. After a mile, Pete called down. "We're clear. They missed us." The merchant collapsed in his seat. His wife started crying. The preacher whispered thanks to God. James watched Sarah, who was crying silently as Catherine nursed. Tears fell onto the baby's face, but Sarah didn't wipe them away. "Thank you," James whispered. "You saved her life. You saved all of us." Sarah didn't respond. She just held Catherine close, giving her body's gift to a child who wasn't hers, mourning the child who should have been. When they reached the next station, James helped Sarah down from the coach. Catherine was asleep in his arms, peaceful for the first time in weeks. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "California. My sister's there." "What's in California?" "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." Sarah looked exhausted. James made a decision. "Come to Denver with us. My sister has room. You could... Catherine needs you. I need help." "I'm not a wet nurse for hire, Mr. Thornton." "I'm not offering employment. I'm offering..." He struggled for words. "A chance, for both of us. You lost your family. I lost my wife. Catherine lost her mother. Maybe we can help each other." Sarah looked at the sleeping baby, at this man who'd lost everything, just like her. "1 week," she said finally. "I'll come to Denver for 1 week, then I decide." James nodded, relief flooding through him. 1 week became 2, then a month, then forever. Sarah Mitchell never made it to California. She became Catherine's mother in all but name, and eventually, James's wife in truth. The grief never fully left either of them, but they learned to carry it together. And Catherine grew up knowing she'd been saved by a stranger's impossible sacrifice, a gift of milk and mercy that changed 3 lives forever. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we're born into. Sometimes it's the one we find in the darkest moments, when strangers become saviors and grief transforms into grace. Sarah Mitchell woke before dawn on the day she left Wyoming forever. The boarding house room was cold, empty except for her carpet bag and the black dress she'd worn to 2 funerals. She dressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Then came the binding, long strips of cloth wrapped tight around her chest until she could barely breathe. The pain was constant now. Her body kept producing milk, kept preparing for a baby who would never come. The doctor said it would stop eventually. Eventually. Sarah pulled the binding tighter, welcoming the physical pain. It was easier than the other kind. Thomas had been a good man, a ranch hand with calloused hands and big dreams. They'd married young, saved every penny for their own place someday. Then came the stampede. A spooked herd, a fall from his horse, hooves everywhere. They'd brought him home in pieces. Sarah had been 8 months pregnant. The shock sent her into early labor. The baby, a boy, she'd seen his tiny face, never drew breath. The midwife said sometimes it just happens. God's will. Sarah stopped believing in God's will that day. Her sister Martha lived in California, married to a shopkeeper, 3 healthy children, a house with a garden. Martha's letters were full of sunshine and new beginnings. "Come west," she'd written after Thomas died. "Leave that cursed territory behind." So Sarah was leaving. The stagecoach ticket had cost nearly everything she had left. She'd arrive in California with $5 and a carpet bag. It would have to be enough. She walked to the station as the sun rose, each step sending sharp pains through her bound chest. The stagecoach was already there, Pete loading luggage onto the roof. Other passengers milled about. A merchant couple, a young cowboy, a preacher. Then she saw him. A man in expensive clothes, holding a screaming baby like it might explode. He looked terrified. James Thornton had no idea what he was doing. Catherine had been crying since midnight. He'd tried feeding her. She'd refused the bottle. Tried changing her. She'd screamed louder. Tried walking, rocking, singing every lullaby Eleanor used to hum. Nothing worked. Other passengers were staring. The merchant's wife whispered something to her husband, both of them frowning. James felt their judgment like a weight. He was James Thornton. He employed half the territory. He'd built an empire from nothing. But he couldn't quiet one tiny baby. "All aboard," Pete called. James climbed in, Catherine wailing against his shoulder. He took a seat, trying to make himself small, trying to make his daughter invisible. Impossible. Her cries filled every inch of space. The woman in black sat across from him. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the screaming, just stared out the window like she was already gone from this place. Sarah heard every cry. Each one was a knife twisting in her chest. She knew that sound. Hunger, pain, desperation. She knew what the baby needed. Her body knew. The binding grew tighter, more painful. Her breasts ached with milk that had nowhere to go. She turned her face to the window and said nothing. The stagecoach rolled forward. Catherine's screams echoed off the wooden walls. The merchant checked his watch every 5 minutes. His wife offered advice that didn't work. The cowboy escaped to the roof. The preacher prayed. James tried everything. He bounced Catherine gently, then more vigorously. He offered the bottle again. She batted it away. He checked her diaper, her clothes, felt her forehead for fever. Nothing was wrong. Everything was wrong. "I'm sorry," he kept saying to the other passengers. "I'm so sorry. She has colic. The doctor said—" "The doctor isn't trapped in here with us," the merchant muttered. Sarah watched the man struggle, watched him fail over and over. He was rich. She could tell from his clothes, his luggage, the way he carried himself. But money couldn't help him now. Money couldn't stop a baby from crying. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The stagecoach began climbing into the mountains. The road grew rougher. Catherine's cries grew louder, more desperate. Sarah's chest throbbed with each wail. The binding was too tight. She couldn't breathe properly, but loosening it would make things worse. The milk would come, soaking through her dress, humiliating her in front of strangers. She kept the binding tight and endured. Pete's voice came from above. "Dalton territory ahead, folks. Need absolute silence." The merchant's face went pale. "The Dalton gang, here?" "They hit 3 coaches last month," Pete said. "Killed everyone. They listen for travelers, so keep quiet." Everyone looked at James, at Catherine, who was screaming louder than ever. James felt panic rising in his throat. "I can't. I don't know how to stop her." "Figure it out," the merchant snapped, "or you'll get us all killed." Sarah saw the desperation in the man's eyes, saw him try to cover the baby's mouth, then pull his hand away, horrified at himself. Saw him rock her frantically, whispering pleas that went unheard. He was breaking right in front of them. The pain in Sarah's chest was unbearable now. She shifted in her seat, trying to find relief. There was none. Her body was screaming as loud as the baby. "Feed her, feed her, feed her." She closed her eyes and tried to think of California, of Martha's garden, of starting over, of forgetting. Then she saw the riders, shadows moving through the trees, keeping pace with the coach. 4 of them, maybe more, the Dalton gang. Pete saw them too. The stagecoach lurched forward, horses galloping on the narrow mountain road. Inside, passengers grabbed the walls for balance. Catherine's screams reached a fever pitch. "They found us," the merchant's wife whispered. "Oh God, they found us." The preacher clutched his Bible. The cowboy on the roof shouted something. Pete drove the horses harder. Sarah watched the riders close in, watched them angle toward the road ahead. They were going to cut the coach off, trap them. The baby's cries had led them straight here, like a beacon in the wilderness. The stagecoach suddenly stopped. Pete's voice was tight with fear. "Riders ahead and behind. We're boxed in." Silence fell inside the coach, except for Catherine, who screamed and screamed and screamed. The merchant stood up, his face twisted with terror and rage. "Gag that! Child right now!" "I won't," James started. "Then throw them both out. Let the bandits take them instead of us." The merchant's wife nodded frantically. Even the preacher looked like he was considering it. James backed into the corner, shielding Catherine with his body. He looked like a man watching his world end for the second time. Sarah felt something break inside her. The binding around her chest, the walls around her heart, the determination to stay silent and uninvolved. She'd lost everything. Her husband, her son, her future. She had nothing left to lose, except her humanity. "Give her to me." Her voice cut through the panic. Everyone turned to stare. "Give her to me," Sarah repeated, standing up. Her chest was on fire. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. James stared at her. "What?" "Your daughter. Give her to me, now!" Something in her tone made him obey. He handed Catherine over, the baby's screams filling the space between them. Sarah sat down with the infant in her arms. Then, without hesitation, without explanation, she began unbuttoning her dress. The merchant's wife gasped. The preacher turned away. James opened his mouth to ask what she was doing, but then he understood. "Turn around," Sarah said quietly. "All of you?" They did. Even James, though he kept glancing back, confused and desperate and hopeful all at once. Sarah unwrapped the binding with one hand, still holding Catherine with the other. The relief was immediate and agonizing. Then she brought the baby to her breast. Catherine latched on instantly, and the screaming stopped. The silence was so sudden it felt like a physical thing. Outside, they could hear the bandits calling to each other, their horses moving closer. Inside, there was only the soft sound of an infant feeding and Sarah's quiet tears falling onto Catherine's face. She was feeding someone else's baby, giving her milk, her son's milk, to a stranger's child. It felt like betrayal and redemption, all at once. Pete's whisper drifted down. "They're passing. Stay quiet." The minutes crawled by. Catherine nursed peacefully, her tiny hand resting against Sarah's chest. Sarah held her close, this baby who wasn't hers, and felt something shift inside her. Not healing, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Finally, Pete clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward slowly. The riders fell behind, drawn away by some other sound or simply giving up the search. After a mile, Pete called down, "We're clear." The merchant collapsed in relief. His wife started crying. The preacher thanked God. James turned around slowly, looking at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. "You saved us," he said simply. "You saved my daughter." Sarah looked down at Catherine, who had fallen asleep at her breast, milk-drunk and peaceful. "I saved myself too," she whispered. "I think." When they reached the next station, James helped Sarah down from the coach. She'd buttoned her dress, wrapped the binding loosely, and handed Catherine back. The baby was still sleeping, peaceful for the first time in days. "Where are you going?" James asked. "California." "Why?" "To forget." Sarah looked at him directly. "What about you?" "Denver. My sister's there. She was going to help with Catherine, but—" He trailed off, looking at his sleeping daughter. "I don't know what I'm doing. I've run a cattle empire, managed hundreds of men, built something from nothing, but I can't take care of one baby." Sarah saw the humiliation in his face, the fear, the grief underneath it all. She recognized it because she wore the same expression every time she looked in a mirror. "Money can't fix everything," she said softly. "No." James's voice cracked. "It can't bring back the dead, can't stop a baby from crying, can't make me into the father she needs." He paused. "What you did back there, that took more courage than I've ever had." Sarah shook her head. "It wasn't courage, it was desperation and grief, and—" She touched her chest, where the binding was loose now, where the pain had finally eased. And maybe letting go. James made a decision. He'd been making decisions his whole life. Business decisions, financial decisions, decisions that affected hundreds of people. But this felt different. This felt like the first real choice he'd made since Eleanor died. "Come with us," he said. "To Denver. Not as a wet nurse, not as an employee, as—" He struggled for the word. "As family. Catherine needs you. I need help. And maybe you need us too. Maybe we can help each other survive this." Sarah looked at the sleeping baby. At this broken man who just admitted he couldn't do it alone. At the possibility of something other than running away. "1 week," she said finally. "I'll come for 1 week. Then I decide." James nodded, relief flooding his face. 1 week. But they both knew it would be longer. They both knew that sometimes salvation comes from the strangest places. From a screaming baby on a stagecoach, from a widow's impossible sacrifice, from two broken people finding each other in the wreckage of their lives. The stagecoach rolled on toward Denver, carrying 3 people who'd boarded as strangers and would arrive as something else entirely. Not a family yet, but maybe the beginning of one. Wyoming Territory in 1882 was a land where the law ended at the edge of town and survival depended on luck as much as skill. The mountains held secrets, gold veins, outlaw camps, unmarked graves. The Dalton gang had claimed these passes as their hunting ground, and 3 coaches full of dead passengers proved they were serious about it. The stagecoach that left Cheyenne that morning carried 6 passengers, each running from something. The merchant, Harold Finch, was fleeing debts in Denver. His wife, Agnes, clutched a bag of jewelry she'd stolen from her own mother. The young cowboy, barely 20, had a warrant for cattle rustling in Texas. The preacher, Reverend Mills, had been defrocked for drinking but still wore his collar. Then there was James Thornton, running from grief, and Sarah Mitchell, running from memories. Pete knew his passengers were trouble the moment he saw them. 30 years driving coaches had given him an instinct for danger, but the pay was good and the route was necessary, so he loaded their luggage and prayed they'd all make it to Denver alive. The first hour was tense but manageable. Catherine cried, but the passengers tolerated it. Harold Finch read a newspaper. Agnes knitted. The cowboy dozed. Reverend Mills stared at his Bible without reading it. Sarah watched the landscape roll by, each mile taking her further from the graves she'd left behind. James held Catherine and tried not to fall apart. Every cry reminded him of Eleanor's absence. She would have known what to do. She always knew. But Eleanor was gone, and he was alone with a baby who wouldn't stop screaming and a future that felt impossible to navigate. By the second hour, tolerance turned to irritation. Harold slammed his newspaper down. "Can't you do something about that child?" "I'm trying," James said, his voice strained. "Try harder." Agnes's knitting needles clicked faster, each click a tiny accusation. The cowboy climbed onto the roof to escape. Reverend Mills's lips moved in silent prayer, though whether for patience or deliverance, no one could tell. Sarah felt every cry in her bones. Her chest ached constantly now, the binding so tight she could barely draw a full breath. She'd wrapped it that morning in the dark, pulling the cloth strips until tears came to her eyes. The doctor had told her it would take weeks for the milk to dry up. Weeks of pain, weeks of her body betraying her, preparing for a child who would never need it. She shifted in her seat, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. There wasn't one. The binding pressed against her ribs, constricting her breathing. Beneath it, her breasts were swollen and hot, engorged with milk that had nowhere to go. Sometimes it leaked despite the binding, soaking through the cloth, humiliating her. She'd considered loosening it, but that would make it worse. The milk would come faster, more abundant. She'd learned that the hard way the first week, when she'd tried to be comfortable. The wet patches on her dress had mortified her. Now she kept the binding tight and endured. Across from her, James bounced Catherine desperately. The baby's face was red, her tiny fists clenched. She'd been crying for so long, her voice was getting hoarse. Sarah watched him fumble with the bottle, trying to get Catherine to drink. The baby turned her head away, screaming. He checked her diaper, dry, felt her forehead, no fever, examined her clothes for anything that might be pinching or scratching. Nothing. "What's wrong with her?" Agnes demanded. "Colic," James said. "The doctor said it's colic." "What's that mean?" "It means she cries, for months. There's no cure." Harold snorted. "Convenient diagnosis. Means the doctor gets paid for doing nothing." "It's a real condition," James snapped. "Her digestive system isn't fully developed. She's in pain." "We're all in pain," Agnes muttered. Sarah knew about colic. Her sister Martha's second child had it. She remembered Martha walking the floors night after night, exhausted and desperate. It had lasted 4 months. 4 months of screaming that nearly drove Martha mad. She looked at James Thornton and saw a man at the end of his rope. His clothes were expensive but rumpled. His face was unshaven. His hands shook as he held his daughter. This wasn't a man used to failing, but fatherhood was humbling him in ways his cattle empire never had. Money couldn't fix colic, couldn't soothe a baby's pain, couldn't bring back a dead wife or teach a grieving man how to be both parents at once. The stagecoach began climbing into the mountains. The road narrowed, winding along cliff edges with 100-foot drops. Catherine's cries echoed off the rock walls, amplified and endless. Pete's voice came from above. "Dalton territory, folks. Everyone quiet now." The temperature inside the coach dropped 10 degrees. Harold's face went white. Agnes stopped knitting. Reverend Mills clutched his Bible with both hands. "How quiet?" Harold asked. "Silent as the grave," Pete said. "They listen for coaches. Any sound draws them like flies to honey." Everyone looked at Catherine, who chose that moment to scream louder than ever. "You need to stop her," Harold said to James. "Right now." "I can't. I've tried everything." "Try harder." James stood up in the moving coach, bouncing Catherine frantically. He tried the bottle again. She refused. Tried humming. She screamed through it. Tried covering her mouth gently. She screamed around his fingers. Sarah watched the panic spread through the coach like wildfire. Harold was sweating despite the cold. Agnes had gone pale. Even Reverend Mills looked terrified. They all knew the stories. The Dalton gang showed no mercy. Men, women, children didn't matter. They killed everyone and took everything. The pain in Sarah's chest was unbearable now. Each of Catherine's cries seemed to trigger something in her body, making the ache worse. Her breasts felt like they might burst. The binding was cutting into her skin. She could feel wetness seeping through despite the tight wrapping. Her body was screaming at her. "Feed the baby! Feed the baby! Feed the baby!" She closed her eyes and tried to block it out. This wasn't her problem. This wasn't her baby. She was going to California to start over, to forget, to leave all of this behind. Then she saw the riders. 4 men on horseback, moving through the trees parallel to the road. They wore dusters and wide-brimmed hats. Guns hung from their belts. They were tracking the coach, following the sound of Catherine's cries. Pete saw them too. He whipped the horses into a gallop. The coach lurched forward, throwing passengers against each other. Catherine's screams reached a new pitch. "They found us!" Agnes shrieked. Harold grabbed the window frame, his knuckles white. "We're going to die! We're all going to die because of that baby!" More riders appeared ahead, cutting off their escape. Pete had no choice. He reined the horses to a halt, the coach skidding on the narrow road. "Why are we stopping?" James's voice cracked with terror. "Boxed in," Pete called down. "Riders front and back." The coach fell silent except for Catherine's relentless screaming. Outside, they could hear hoofbeats, men calling to each other, the sound of rifles being cocked. Harold stood up, his face twisted with fear and fury. "Gag her! Gag the child or we're all dead!" "No," James said, backing into the corner with Catherine. "Then throw them out! Give the bandits what they want! Let them take the rich man and his brat!" Agnes nodded frantically. "Yes, throw them out! Save the rest of us!" The cowboy had climbed back inside, his young face pale. Even he was nodding. Reverend Mills opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. James pressed Catherine against his chest, shielding her with his body. "You'll have to kill me first." Harold took a step forward. "That can be arranged." Sarah felt something snap inside her. Not just the binding, though that was loosening, the pain becoming unbearable. Something deeper. Some wall she'd built around herself since the day she'd buried her husband and son. She'd lost everything, her family, her future, her faith in a God who would let such things happen. She had nothing left, except this moment, this choice. She could sit here and watch them throw a baby to the wolves. Watch a father die trying to protect his daughter. Watch cowardice and cruelty win because everyone was too afraid to do the hard thing, or she could do something about it. "Give her to me." The words came out stronger than she felt. Everyone turned to stare at her. "Give me the baby," Sarah repeated, standing up. Her chest was on fire. The binding had loosened enough that she could feel milk starting to leak. She didn't care anymore. James stared at her. "Why? What can you—" "I can feed her. Give her to me now." Understanding dawned on his face. Then horror. "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering. Give her to me before we all die." James handed Catherine over. The baby's screams filled the space between them, desperate and endless. Sarah sat down with the infant in her arms. Then, without hesitation, she began unbuttoning her dress. Agnes gasped. Harold's eyes went wide. Reverend Mills spun around so fast he nearly fell. "Turn around," Sarah said quietly. "All of you, now!" They obeyed. Even Harold, who'd been ready to commit murder seconds ago, turned away from the sight of a woman preparing to nurse. Sarah unwrapped the binding with shaking hands. The relief was immediate and agonizing. Milk was already leaking, soaking her chemise. She didn't care. She brought Catherine to her breast. The baby latched on instantly, instinctively, desperately, and the screaming stopped. The silence was so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. Outside, the bandits were still calling to each other, their horses moving closer. Inside, there was only the soft sound of an infant feeding and Sarah's tears falling onto Catherine's face. She was feeding someone else's baby, giving her milk. The milk her body had made for her son, the son who'd never lived long enough to drink it, to a stranger's child. It felt wrong and right all at once, like betrayal and redemption, like grief and healing happening simultaneously. Catherine's tiny hand rested against Sarah's chest, right over her heart. The baby's eyes were closed, her face peaceful for the first time. She drank greedily, making small, satisfied sounds. Sarah felt something break open inside her. Not her heart, that had broken weeks ago. Something else. Some hard, frozen place where she'd locked away all her pain and grief and rage at the unfairness of it all. The milk flowed freely now, and with it came tears. For Thomas, who died too young. For their son, who'd never drawn breath. For the life they'd planned that would never happen. For the mother she'd never get to be. But also for this. For Catherine, who was alive and hungry and needed her. For this moment of purpose in the midst of meaningless loss. For the strange gift of being able to give life even after death had taken everything. Pete's whisper drifted down from above. They're passing us by. Stay quiet. The minutes stretched like hours. Catherine nursed peacefully, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing. Sarah held her close and let the tears fall silently. Outside, the bandits' voices grew fainter. The hoofbeats receded. They were moving away, drawn by some other sound or simply giving up the search. Finally, Pete clicked his tongue softly. The horses moved forward, slowly at first, then faster as the danger passed. After a mile, Pete called down, "We're clear, Daltons are gone." The passengers exhaled collectively. Harold collapsed in his seat, his face in his hands. Agnes started crying. The cowboy looked like he might be sick. Reverend Mills whispered a prayer of thanks. James turned around slowly. He looked at Sarah, holding his daughter, at Catherine nursing peacefully, at the tears on Sarah's face. His own eyes were wet. "You saved her," he whispered. "You saved all of us." Sarah looked down at Catherine, who had fallen asleep at her breast, milk drunk and content. "I saved myself too," she said softly. "I think maybe we saved each other." The other passengers were silent now, watching. Agnes had stopped crying. Harold had lowered his hands. Even the cowboy was staring. They were witnessing something they didn't fully understand, something sacred and profane all at once. A woman nursing a child that wasn't hers, a gift given from the depths of grief, the power of maternal love transcending blood and loss and social convention. Reverend Mills spoke for the first time in hours. "That," he said quietly, "is what grace looks like." Sarah carefully detached Catherine from her breast and buttoned her dress. The baby stayed asleep, peaceful in her arms. She looked at James, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "She'll be hungry again in a few hours," Sarah said. "The colic won't go away, but at least she'll be fed." James nodded slowly. "Come with us to Denver, please, not as a servant, as—" He struggled for the word. "As whatever you want to be. Catherine needs you, I need help, and maybe—" He paused. "Maybe you need us too." Sarah looked at the sleeping baby in her arms, at this man who'd been humbled by fatherhood and grief, at the possibility of purpose instead of just escape. Her body had made milk for a baby who died, but maybe that milk could still give life. Maybe her grief could still serve a purpose. Maybe running away wasn't the only option. "1 week," she said finally. "I'll come for 1 week." But they both knew it would be longer. They both knew that sometimes healing doesn't come from forgetting. Sometimes it comes from finding a new reason to remember, a new purpose for the pain. A new life built from the wreckage of the old one. The stagecoach rolled on toward Denver, carrying 6 passengers who'd boarded as strangers and would arrive forever changed by what they'd witnessed. By a baby's cry and a widow's sacrifice. By milk and mercy in the mountains of Wyoming territory. Denver appeared on the horizon 3 days later, a sprawling collection of buildings against the Rocky Mountains. Sarah had nursed Catherine 6 more times during the journey, each feeding a little easier than the last, each one chipping away at the wall around her heart. The other passengers had grown quiet after the bandit encounter. Harold and Agnes kept to themselves, shamefaced. The Cowboy had tipped his hat to Sarah at the last station. Reverend Mills had blessed her when he departed, his hand trembling on her shoulder. Now it was just James, Sarah, and Catherine as the coach rolled into Denver. James's sister lived in a large house on the edge of town. Margaret Thornton Hayes was a formidable woman who'd raised 5 children and buried a husband. She took one look at her brother, exhausted, unshaven, holding a sleeping baby, and ushered them all inside without questions. "You look like death," she told James. "And who's this?" "Sarah Mitchell," James said. "She saved Catherine's life, saved all our lives, actually." Margaret's sharp eyes took in Sarah's mourning clothes, her worn carpet bag, the way she held herself like someone expecting to be turned away. "Well then, Sarah Mitchell, you're welcome in my home as long as you need." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you. I won't impose long." "Impose all you like," Margaret said firmly. "Any woman who saves my niece is family." That word, family, hung in the air like a promise. The first week passed in a blur. Catherine's colic continued, but with Sarah there to nurse her, the screaming fits were shorter. James learned to change diapers, to burp the baby, to recognize the difference between hungry cries and tired cries. Margaret taught him how to hold Catherine properly, how to support her head, how to be gentle but confident. Sarah watched him transform from a terrified, fumbling father into something resembling competent. He still made mistakes, put the diaper on backward, forgot to test the bathwater temperature, panicked when Catherine spit up. But he was trying, learning, growing into the role he'd never expected to fill alone. And Sarah was changing too. Each time she nursed Catherine, she felt a little less broken. The physical relief was part of it. No more painful binding, no more milk leaking through her clothes. But it was more than that. It was purpose. It was being needed. It was the weight of a baby in her arms and the knowledge that she was keeping that baby alive. At night, she still cried for her son, for Thomas, for the life she'd lost. But during the day, she had Catherine. And somehow, that made the grief bearable. The week ended. Sarah didn't leave. "Stay another week," James said. "Please, just until Catherine's colic improves," Sarah agreed. One more week, but the colic didn't improve, and Sarah didn't leave. Margaret watched the two of them circle each other like wounded animals, both too damaged to admit they needed each other, both too afraid to hope for anything beyond survival. "You're being idiots," she told James one evening while Sarah was upstairs with Catherine. "Both of you." "What are you talking about?" "That woman saved your daughter's life. She's nursing your child. She's living in your sister's house, and you're treating her like a temporary employee. I offered her a permanent position." "A position?" Margaret's voice rose. "James Thornton, you thick-headed fool. She doesn't want a position, she wants a family, and so do you, and so does Catherine." James stared at his sister. "Eleanor's only been gone 2 months, and Sarah's husband and baby have been gone 6 weeks. You think grief has a schedule? You think there's a proper timeline for moving forward?" Margaret softened her tone. "I'm not saying marry her tomorrow. I'm saying stop pretending this is temporary. Stop treating her like hired help. She's not your employee. She's Catherine's mother in every way that matters." James felt tears prick his eyes. Eleanor was Catherine's mother. "Eleanor is dead." Margaret's words were harsh but necessary. "And I loved Eleanor like a sister. But she's gone, and Catherine is here, and that baby needs a mother who's alive. Sarah is giving her that. The question is, are you going to let her, or are you going to let pride and grief and propriety drive her away? Upstairs, Sarah sat in the rocking chair with Catherine asleep at her breast. The baby's face was peaceful, her tiny hand curled against Sarah's chest. Sarah stroked the soft dark hair, so like Eleanor's must have been. She thought about Thomas every day, about their son, who she'd named Samuel in her heart, even though he'd never lived long enough for a christening. She thought about the life they'd planned, the ranch they'd save for, the children they'd raise, the future that had died with them. But she also thought about Catherine, about James, who was learning to be a father despite his fear, about Margaret, who'd welcomed her without hesitation, about this house that was starting to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like home. She thought about California, where her sister waited, about the plan to start over, to forget, to leave Wyoming and all its painful memories behind. But maybe starting over didn't mean running away. Maybe it meant building something new from the wreckage of the old. Maybe it meant letting herself love again, even when love had already cost her everything. Catherine stirred, making small sounds in her sleep. Sarah held her closer and made a decision. The next morning, she found James in the study. He was writing letters, managing his ranch from a distance. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "I need to tell you something," they both said simultaneously. James laughed nervously. "You first." Sarah took a breath. "I'm not going to California." James's face transformed. "You're not?" "No, I'm staying here, if you'll have me. Not as a wet nurse or a nanny or an employee, as—" She struggled for the word. "As family, if that's something you want." James stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "Sarah, I've been trying to figure out how to ask you to stay without sounding like I'm taking advantage of your grief or your situation or your kindness. I don't want to hire you. I want—" He paused. "I want what Margaret said. I want you to be Catherine's mother, and eventually, if you're willing, I want you to be my wife." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I still love Thomas. I still love Eleanor. I don't know if I can love someone else yet." "Neither do I." James reached for her hand. "But maybe we can learn together. Maybe we can build something new without forgetting what we lost. Maybe we can be a family, not the families we planned for, but the family we need now." Sarah looked at their joined hands. His were calloused from ranch work despite his wealth. Hers were rough from years of hard labor, both of them scarred by loss, both of them trying to survive. "One day at a time," she said softly. "One day at a time," James agreed. They stood there in the study, two broken people holding on to each other and hoping it would be enough. It was. 6 months later, Sarah and James were married in Margaret's parlor. Catherine, now 9 months old and finally past her colic, gurgled happily in Sarah's arms during the ceremony. The guest list was small. Margaret's family, a few ranch hands, Reverend Mills, who'd sobered up and found his faith again after witnessing Sarah's sacrifice on the stagecoach. Sarah wore a simple dress, not white. She was a widow, after all, but a soft blue that matched her eyes. James wore his best suit and looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to pray. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah felt Thomas's presence like a blessing rather than a ghost. She would always love him, always carry him in her heart. But she could love James too, differently, but no less real. They moved back to James's ranch, the sprawling estate that had felt like a mausoleum after Eleanor's death. But with Sarah and Catherine there, it came alive again. Sarah planted a garden. James taught her to ride. Catherine took her first steps in the great room, both parents cheering. They had more. Children, 2 boys and another girl. Sarah nursed them all, her body finally fulfilling the purpose it had prepared for. Each child was loved fiercely, but Catherine remained special, the baby who'd brought them together, the catalyst for their unlikely family. On quiet evenings, James and Sarah would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked about Eleanor and Thomas, keeping their memories alive. Sometimes they talked about the future, about the children, about the ranch. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful from the ruins. The Stagecoach incident became a story they told their children. About the day a baby's cries almost got them killed. About bandits in the mountains and impossible choices. About a widow who gave everything when she had nothing left to give. About how sometimes the family you need isn't the one you're born into, but the one you find in the darkest moments. Catherine grew up knowing she'd been saved by a stranger's sacrifice. That the woman she called mother had chosen her, had fed her with milk meant for another baby, had loved her when she didn't have to. "Why did you do it?" Catherine asked Sarah once, when she was old enough to understand. "Why did you help us when you'd lost so much?" Sarah thought about that day on the stagecoach, about the pain in her chest and the grief in her heart, about the moment she decided to act instead of hide, about choosing life over death, hope over despair, love over fear. "Because," she said finally, "sometimes the only way to heal your own broken heart is to help mend someone else's. You and your father were drowning, and I was drowning too, but together, we learned to swim." Years later, when Sarah was old and Catherine had children of her own, they would sit together and talk about that journey, about how tragedy can lead to unexpected blessings, about how the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for the best ones, about how love doesn't replace love, it multiplies it. Sarah Mitchell Thornton died at 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. James held her hand as she slipped away, just as she'd held his during the hardest years of his life. Her last words were about the stagecoach, about the day everything changed. "I thought I was saving you," she whispered to James. "But you saved me too." And maybe that's what salvation really is. Not a grand gesture or a divine intervention, but two broken people reaching for each other in the darkness and deciding to hold on. Two strangers becoming family. Two tragedies transforming into one beautiful, imperfect, hard-won life. The baby who screamed on a stagecoach. The widow who did the unthinkable. The cattle baron who learned that wealth means nothing without humanity. Three souls who found each other when they needed it most and built a family from grief and grace and the simple, profound act of choosing each other. One day at a time. One feeding at a time. One moment of courage at a time, until strangers became salvation and salvation became home. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected families. Share this with someone who needs to hear that even in our darkest moments, hope can find us in the most surprising ways.